In China, we run into many of the same problems that we run into in other ancient societies. The climate in China is one that is not conducive to preserving wood. And of course, they're building most of their furniture out of wood, including their seats. But it goes one step further. You see, the tradition in China is one of almost a floor culture. They will, for much of their history, sit on the floor. And in fact, seating is added much later in their history than what we see in other societies. Now, this isn't necessarily due to poverty or lack of ideas, but rather it's simply a different aesthetic, a different concept of how the world should work. If I have a fairly small home, I may not want a lot of furniture. Also, the philosophies at work in China tend to be fairly anti-material and minimalistic. So this is all playing into it. Now, you will see on occasion the use of a kang bed or other platform as a seating surface, but as you can see in this illustration, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're sitting on the edge in the form of a traditional chair, but rather they're simply sitting on the platform. Now, there is a tradition of a very basic backrest that would allow for seating at floor level a little bit more comfortably, but we don't see very many of them surviving from ancient China. The other thing to keep in mind is trade. We tend to think of China as particularly isolated, but historically speaking, it really isn't. The Silk Road, where people go to buy drugs with where people go to trade back and forth between Europe and Asia, actually opens as early as 500 BCE, and we continue to find evidence that it's open earlier and earlier, which means they're getting ideas from other places. Now, this becomes important because in China, when chairs are introduced, they're referred to as sitting in sort of the barbarian style, which means it's coming from outside. It's not something that they're inventing, not that they couldn't, but it simply isn't important. So it's likely something that's coming in via the Silk Road. One of the forms that we see early on is called the dun stool, and this is a stool built in the form of a drum. It's this barrel shape with a wide center, and then the base and the foot are nearly identical. That foot acts as a stretcher. It allows these legs to hold together, creating a very strong structure. Occasionally, these are made out of one piece, but more commonly, you're going to see multiple pieces. You can see the join right here, where the vertical and horizontal pieces meet. To be put together. So we see multiple pieces put together to create the stool. Obviously, there would be some kind of cushion for the top. That doesn't typically survive because, of course, textiles don't typically survive for very long. This would be lightweight, simple, and easy to move around. It really fits the aesthetic of the Chinese home as far as we're aware at this period. Now, there's one other place where China is getting ideas: the Hellenistic Greeks. This is the Greeks under Alexander the Great and later. And the Greek Empire at that point stretches as far as what today we might refer to as almost Western China. They're already at the Indus River Valley, which means trade between the Greeks and the Chinese is relatively simple. And mind you, I'm saying relatively, there's some rough terrain to cover, but there are Silk Road trade routes running through to China. We know the Greeks are trading with the Chinese. We also know that things like Buddhism are showing up in Europe as early as 200 BCE. So we know that there's trade, and we see it here with the folding stool. Now, on the left, I have the Greek version. On the right, we see a Chinese version from roughly the Tang Dynasty. And what you're seeing is really taking the stool and turning it. So here's our crossbars running along the side. You'll see this more clearly in my next slide. And we see that here in the Greek version. The Greeks, of course, getting it from the Egyptians. What the Chinese have done is they've added a back to it. And this is a barrel form back, so it's a very rounded form. Typically, this would be steamed, so The wood has been steamed to shape. Sometimes these will be cut. And you can see that it's meant to come apart. We have these hinges here that may be simply holding it in place, but you could imagine there's a couple of dowels that allow you to take this apart and fold it up. In a society where I want to have multi-function rooms, that's going to be incredibly useful. Now in the Tang Dynasty, we start to see these chairs taking off and becoming more Western in form. Here's our basic stool. Of course, you knew that some form of folding stool was going to turn up. It turns up in every society, so this is probably something they're getting from the Greeks. It could also be parallel development, the Chinese developing it at the same time that the Greeks, the Romans, the Egyptians, and everyone else are. We see that added here to our folding chair. Very similar ideas, so you can see those similarities. You can see that back on it. And then we have these two. We have a square high back chair, and here we have a barrel back. Now, the barrel back is going to be more comfortable, but more complicated to build. This takes more craftsmanship, trying to curve wood, as opposed to this, where everything is 90 degrees. You also get a sense of their design sensibilities in the Tang Dynasty. You see a very curvilinear design to all of the elements in this chair. In other words, everything is curved. It's made up of curves. You see that in the barrel back chair as well, but it's interesting that it exists here. We would typically in the West see this as straight uprights and everything else. This could be an attempt to make it more comfortable, but it could also be an attempt to make it simply more aesthetic. It's something that's necessary, and therefore let's make it beautiful. You'll also notice that they have stringers very low on the chair, much lower than what we typically see in the West. The lower I put those stringers, the stronger the chair is going to be, especially if I'm using very lightweight materials as we see here. Now in the West, you might expect a really heavy chair. In fact, when we get into the Gothic and some other periods of Western history, we see exactly that. These big, heavy oak chairs, the sort of thing that goes generation to generation, the sort of thing that, well, simply is never going to break down. But in China, you see something that tends to be a lot more delicate. They're focusing on craftsmanship and focusing on almost, I hate to say miracle, but they're almost creating this idea that the chair is deceivingly lightweight, that the fact that it can hold a fully grown human being is almost miraculous. And that speaks to the abilities of the artisan, not only to create a beautiful chair, but to engineer one that's going to be particularly strong and capable of holding those loads. The seats, you'll notice, are woven, and that is typical not only in Europe but also in China, because it is just simply a better use of resources. I can create a more comfortable seat, and that seat takes up a lot less solid wood, which is going to be more expensive. You notice that this is made up of small pieces of wood. Much like in Egypt, they're trying to be as resourceful as possible.